No one remembers what Elvis Presley sang that evening. No one remembers what he wore, or how many thousands of people filled the boardwalk beside the ocean. Because before the sun disappeared beyond the waves, something happened that no newspaper could fully explain, and no one who witnessed it would ever forget. A young girl walked past the real Elvis Presley, ignored him completely, walked straight to a giant photograph of him, closed her eyes, and gently kissed the picture. The crowd exploded with laughter. 5 seconds later, Elvis placed a hand on her shoulder. She slowly turned around, looked into his eyes, and whispered only 7 words. Those 7 words shattered a promise buried beneath almost 20 years of memories, and reduced the king of rock and roll to tears in front of thousands of people. But to understand why, you have to go back to the moment when everyone believed the girl had embarrassed herself. The afternoon sunlight painted the ocean in shimmering gold as waves rolled gently against the wooden pier. The famous seaside promenade was alive with music, laughter, and excitement. Street performers entertained children. Vendors called out to passing tourists. The scent of fresh popcorn, roasted peanuts, and salty sea air drifted through the breeze. Yet none of those sounds mattered anymore. Every eye was fixed on one man, Elvis Presley. Word had spread through the city only that morning that Elvis would greet fans before leaving for his next performance. Within hours, the promenade had become a sea of people. Teenagers screamed every time they caught a glimpse of him. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, hoping they would remember this day forever. Elderly couples clutched worn vinyl records they had protected for years. Young musicians carried guitars, dreaming of shaking the hand of the man who had inspired them to chase impossible dreams. Television cameras lined the edge of the crowd. Photographers stood on benches for a better view. Security guards struggled to hold back the growing wave of excited fans. But Elvis never rushed. He greeted every person as though they were the only ones standing there. He signed albums. He shook trembling hands. He laughed with children. He hugged veterans. He thanked every fan who had waited beneath the hot afternoon sun. Fame had changed many things in his life, but it had never changed the kindness in his eyes. The crowd adored him for it, not because he was the biggest star in America, but because, somehow, he still treated strangers like neighbors. Every few moments, another burst of applause echoed across the boardwalk. Another autograph, another smile, another photograph. Everything felt perfect. Until someone started laughing. At first, it was only one voice, then another, then several more. Within seconds, laughter spread across the crowd like a wave crashing against the shore. People began pointing toward the far end of the promenade. Phones rose into the air. Cameras turned away from Elvis. Even the reporters stopped filming him. Curious, Elvis lifted his head. "What happened?" he quietly asked one of his security guards. The guard looked toward the crowd and shrugged. "I don't know, sir." Elvis followed everyone's gaze. Standing beside an enormous promotional portrait of him was a young girl. She looked no older than 16. She wasn't dressed like the other fans. No sparkling jacket, no expensive camera, no colorful sign begging for an autograph. She wore a faded, pale blue cardigan over a simple white dress that had clearly been stitched more than once. Her shoes were worn. The strap of an old brown shoulder bag rested across her shoulder. She looked as though life had asked too much of someone so young. Yet none of that was what caught Elvis's attention. It was her eyes. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't excited. She wasn't even looking at him. Slowly, almost carefully, she stepped closer to the enormous photograph. The laughter around her only grew louder. Someone shouted, "Hey! The real Elvis is over here!" More laughter. Another voice yelled, "She doesn't even know he's standing 20 feet away." A group of teenagers burst into laughter. One of them pretended to kiss another advertising poster. The crowd roared. Several people began recording the moment, already imagining how funny it would look later. The young girl never reacted, not once. She acted as though the entire world had disappeared. She stood directly in front of the towering photograph, raised one trembling hand. Her fingertips gently rested against Elvis's printed face. Then, she closed her eyes. The laughter became deafening. "She's actually doing it," someone whistled. Another person clapped sarcastically. But the girl never heard them. Or perhaps she chose not to. Very slowly, a single tear escaped from beneath her closed eyes. It rolled silently down her cheek. Then another. She leaned closer, not with excitement, not with admiration, but with the heartbreaking tenderness of someone saying goodbye to the last piece of a person they loved. And then, she kissed the photograph, softly, carefully, as though she were afraid even paper could break. The crowd erupted. Some people doubled over laughing. Others pointed their cameras directly at her. One man shouted loudly enough for nearly everyone to hear, "Look at her! The real Elvis is standing right there, and she's kissing a poster!" The boardwalk exploded with mocking applause. But one person never laughed. Elvis Presley. Something deep inside him suddenly felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. Everyone else saw an embarrassed fan. Elvis saw something else. Pain. Pure, silent, unbearable pain. He had seen that expression before. In hospitals, at funerals, in mothers saying goodbye to sons leaving for war. That wasn't the face of someone meeting her hero. It was the face of someone losing someone they loved. Without saying a word, Elvis handed his pen back to his assistant. His manager looked confused. "Elvis, the schedule." "It can wait." "The reporters are waiting." "They can wait too." "The television interview." "Everything waits." His voice was calm, but something in his eyes had already changed. He stepped away from the autograph table. Thousands of people instinctively moved aside. Even the laughter began fading. Nobody understood why Elvis was walking away from hundreds of waiting fans, toward one unknown girl. The only sounds left were the crashing waves and the slow rhythm of Elvis's footsteps across the wooden boards, one after another, after another. The closer he came, the clearer he could hear her breathing. It wasn't steady. She was trying and failing to stop herself from crying. Elvis stopped only inches behind her. For a brief moment, he simply watched. The wind gently moved her hair. Her shoulders trembled. She still hadn't noticed him. Very carefully, as though afraid he might shatter whatever fragile moment she was holding on to, Elvis lifted his hand and rested it gently upon her shoulder. Time stopped. The laughter vanished. The cameras froze. Even the seagulls above seemed to disappear into silence. The young girl slowly turned around. Her eyes met his. The color drained from her face. Her lips trembled. Fresh tears filled her eyes. For several endless seconds, Neither of them spoke. Then, barely above a whisper, she looked directly into Elvis's eyes and said 7 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I wasn't kissing you. I was kissing my mother's last dream." The world around Elvis disappeared, because somewhere deep inside his heart, a memory he had buried almost 20 years earlier had just begun to wake up. The words echoed inside Elvis's mind long after the young girl had fallen silent. "I wasn't kissing you. I was kissing my mother's last dream." The laughter was gone. The cameras were still recording, but no one dared to speak. Thousands of people stood frozen, watching the king of rock and roll stare into the tear-filled eyes of a girl he had never met. Yet somehow, she had just awakened a memory he couldn't quite reach. Elvis swallowed hard. For the first time that afternoon, he couldn't find the right words. "What did you say?" he asked softly. The girl lowered her eyes. She wiped away a tear with the sleeve of her faded cardigan. "I wasn't waiting to meet you." Her voice trembled. "I came here because my mother couldn't." Another tear rolled down her cheek. "And today was the only day I could finally keep the promise I made to her." Elvis felt something tighten inside his chest. The noise of the ocean disappeared. The cheering crowd disappeared. Even the television cameras no longer mattered. Only the girl standing in front of him existed. Very gently, Elvis spoke again. "What is your name?" She looked at him for a moment before answering. "My name is Emily." "How old are you, Emily?" 18. "And your mother?" Emily's lips began to tremble again. For several seconds, she couldn't answer. Finally, she whispered, "She passed away last winter." A quiet gasp spread through the crowd. Even people standing far away lowered their phones. No one had expected the story to take this turn. Elvis slowly nodded. "I'm so sorry." Emily gave him a weak smile. "She wouldn't want you to be." Before Elvis could respond, she slowly opened the old brown shoulder bag hanging from her shoulder. She reached inside with extraordinary care, almost as if she were holding something far more valuable than gold. She pulled out a small cloth wrapped around a flat object. The cloth itself was faded with age. Its edges had been sewn back together several times. It had clearly been opened and closed thousands of times. Carefully, Emily unfolded it. Inside lay an old black and white photograph. Time had stained its corners yellow. Several tiny cracks ran across its surface, but the face in the center was unmistakable. A young Elvis Presley, smiling, standing outside a concert hall with dozens of fans surrounding him. The photograph was old enough to belong to another lifetime. Emily held it with both hands before offering it to him. "My mother carried this everywhere." Elvis accepted it slowly. The instant his fingers touched the photograph, something inside him stirred. The paper felt strangely familiar. His eyes traveled across every detail. The old jacket he had worn, the vintage microphone stand behind him, the theater entrance, the smiling crowd. Then he turned the picture over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were words that made his heartbeat stop. "One day I'll meet you again. I promise. Elvis." His breathing caught. For a moment, He simply stared. His fingers began to shake. No, it couldn't be. Could it? Fragments of memories flashed through his mind. Bright stage lights, screaming fans, rain falling outside an old theater, a frightened young woman standing alone near the backstage entrance, tears running down her face. Then, a smile, a photograph, a promise. Elvis closed his eyes. He could almost hear her voice again. Nearly 20 years earlier, he had finished one of the biggest concerts of his career. Security had rushed him toward the waiting limousine. Fans surrounded every exit. People screamed his name from every direction. Then, he noticed one young woman standing apart from everyone else. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't pushing through the crowd. She wasn't even asking for an autograph. She was crying. Elvis had stopped, against everyone's advice. His manager had warned him they were already running late. Security had begged him to keep moving. But something about the young woman's face reminded him of his own mother. So he walked over. "Are you all right?" She had tried to smile. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" She had looked down at the ground. "Your music helped me survive the hardest year of my life." Elvis had remained silent. She explained that she worked 2 jobs. She cared for her sick father. She had almost sold the concert ticket to buy medicine, but her father insisted she should come. He said, she had laughed through tears, that sometimes people need hope more than money. Elvis had smiled, then reached into his pocket. He found one of his publicity photographs, signed it, and before handing it to her, he had written something without thinking. "One day, I'll meet you again. I promise." At the time, they had seemed like simple words, kind words, nothing more. He had no idea that for one woman, those words would become the most precious promise of her entire life. Elvis slowly opened his eyes. His vision blurred. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the photograph. Emily watched him quietly. "My mother never believed you forgot." Elvis looked up. She continued. "Everyone told her you met thousands of people." "They said you couldn't possibly remember." "They laughed whenever she showed them the photograph." Emily smiled sadly. "But every birthday, every Christmas, every year, she would take this picture out. She would clean the dust from the frame. And she'd say, 'One day, Elvis will remember.'" The crowd stood completely silent. Some people were already wiping tears from their faces. Emily reached into her bag one more time. This time, she removed an old envelope. The paper had become brittle with age. Its corners were worn soft from years of being held. "My mother asked me to give this to you, but only if I ever met you." Elvis accepted the envelope carefully. His name was written across the front. The handwriting was uneven, as though the writer's hands had grown weak. He hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a single, handwritten letter. The first line alone stole the air from his lungs. "Dear Elvis, if you're reading this, then my daughter found you when I no longer could." A tear rolled down Elvis's cheek before he even reached the next sentence. He kept reading. The world around him faded away. Every word felt heavier than the last. The letter didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for fame. It didn't ask for another concert. It asked for only one thing, one final promise. By the time Elvis reached the last page, he could no longer hide the tears filling his eyes. He folded the letter slowly, pressed it against his chest, looked toward the endless ocean,
and whispered words no microphone was close enough to hear.
"I remember now."
Then he turned back toward Emily. His eyes were red. His voice was barely steady.
"I made your mother a promise."
He paused, ashamed.
"And I made her wait almost 20 years.
Emily gently shook her head.
"No, you didn't. My mother said some promises don't arrive late. They arrive exactly when they're needed."
Elvis closed his eyes. But deep inside, he knew this story wasn't over. Not even close. Because before the sun disappeared that evening, he intended to keep the promise he should never have forgotten. And what he was about to do would become one of the most unforgettable moments of his entire life.
For several long moments, Elvis Presley stood motionless. The old letter rested in his trembling hands. The ocean breeze gently moved its fragile pages. Thousands of people surrounded him. Hundreds of cameras pointed in his direction, yet, for the first time in years, the king of rock and roll wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the television interview waiting for him. He wasn't thinking about the sold-out concert scheduled later that evening. His mind was somewhere else. Almost 20 years in the past. He slowly folded the letter, held it carefully against his heart, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I'm sorry." No microphone captured those words. They weren't meant for the audience. They were meant for one woman who would never hear them. When Elvis opened his eyes again, he looked at Emily. The young girl stood quietly, still holding the faded photograph that her mother had treasured for almost 2 decades. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some emotions are too heavy for words. Elvis gently reached out. "May I see the photograph one more time?" Emily nodded. He took it carefully. His thumb brushed across the faded signature he had written so many years before. The ink had faded, the paper had aged, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. "One day, I'll meet you again. I promise." Elvis stared at those words for several seconds. Then something changed in his expression. The sadness was still there, but now there was determination. He looked toward his manager. "Cancel everything." The manager blinked. "Everything?" "The interview. The dinner. The rehearsal. The evening schedule." The manager looked stunned. "But Elvis!" "There are thousands of people waiting for tonight's show." Elvis slowly shook his head. "They've waited a few hours." He looked back at Emily. "She waited almost 20 years. No one argued again. Within minutes, assistants rushed across the promenade. Technicians rolled speakers into place. A small portable stage overlooking the ocean was quickly assembled. Microphones were connected. Musicians hurried from nearby vehicles carrying guitars, a piano, and a small drum kit. The crowd watched in complete silence. No one left. No one complained. Somehow, everyone understood they were about to witness something far more important than a concert. The sun had already begun sinking toward the horizon. Golden light reflected across the waves. The sky slowly turned shades of orange and crimson. Seagulls drifted silently above the water. It almost felt as though nature itself had stopped to watch. A few minutes later, Elvis stepped onto the small stage. No dazzling lights, no fireworks, no giant orchestra, just one microphone, one guitar, and thousands of quiet hearts. He looked across the sea of faces. Then his eyes found Emily standing in the front row. She still held her mother's photograph tightly against her chest.
Elvis took a slow breath. His voice came quietly. When people talk about music, they usually remember the songs. A faint smile crossed his face. They remember the records, the concerts, the applause. He paused. But today, I remembered something much more important. His eyes filled with tears again. A promise. The crowd remained perfectly still. I've been blessed beyond anything I ever dreamed. I've met millions of people. I've shaken thousands of hands. I've signed more photographs than I could ever count. But somewhere along the road, I forgot that every face carries a story. He looked toward Emily. Almost 20 years ago, I met a young woman after a concert. I thought I was giving her a photograph. He smiled sadly. It turns out, I was giving her hope. Silence. Complete silence. And today, her daughter reminded me that hope can live longer than memory. Several people in the audience quietly wiped away tears. Elvis looked down for a moment, then back toward the crowd. I've stood on the biggest stages in the world. I've performed for kings, for presidents, for arenas filled with screaming fans. But I have never been more honored than I am standing here tonight. He slowly lifted his guitar. This song isn't for the crowd. It isn't for television. It isn't for history. He looked toward the evening sky. It's for a promise I should never have forgotten. The musicians began playing softly. The melody floated across the ocean, gentle, heartbreaking, beautiful. Elvis began to sing. His voice was quieter than usual. Every word carried the weight of regret. Every note carried gratitude. The audience didn't cheer. No one shouted. Many simply closed their eyes and listened. Halfway through the song, Elvis suddenly stopped singing. His voice caught in his throat. He tried again. Nothing came out. He lowered his head. Tears rolled freely down his face. For several seconds, the only sound anyone could hear was the ocean. Then something extraordinary happened. Without anyone asking, thousands of people quietly continued the song for him. One voice, then another, then hundreds, then thousands. The boardwalk became one enormous choir. People who had never met each other were singing together. Not perfectly, not professionally, but honestly. Elvis looked up in disbelief. His eyes overflowed again. He placed one hand over his heart and simply listened. When the final note faded into the evening air, no one clapped, not immediately. The silence itself became the applause. Elvis slowly stepped down from the stage. He walked toward Emily. She stood frozen,
still holding her mother's photograph. Without saying a word, Elvis reached beneath the collar of his shirt. Around his neck hung the necklace he almost never removed, his famous TCB pendant. Taking care of business. It had become one of the most recognizable symbols of his life. Fans had seen it in photographs, on stage, during interviews. It was more than jewelry. It was part of him. Slowly, he unclasped it. Emily immediately shook her head. "I can't." Elvis smiled gently. "Yes, you can." He carefully placed the pendant into her hands. "This belonged to me for many years." He closed her fingers around it. "But from today, it also belongs to your mother." Emily burst into tears. She hugged the pendant tightly against her heart. Then, without warning, she embraced Elvis. He hugged her back like a father comforting his own daughter. Many people in the audience openly cried. Even reporters lowered their cameras. Some moments are too sacred to capture through a lens. As the crowd slowly began to applaud, an elderly woman stepped forward. She'd been standing near the back all afternoon. Her silver hair moved gently in the breeze. She looked at Emily, then at Elvis.
With tears in her eyes, she quietly said,
"I knew her mother."
Emily looked up in surprise. The woman smiled.
"We worked together many years ago. She carried that photograph every single day."
If someone asked about it,
"She never talked about fame.
she never talked about meeting a celebrity.
She simply smiled and said, 'One good person kept a promise inside my heart.'"
Elvis lowered his head. The elderly woman continued,
"And today,
you finally brought it home." The sun slipped beneath the horizon. The sky darkened. One by one, people began lighting small candles they had bought from nearby vendors. Within minutes, thousands of tiny lights stretched along the boardwalk beside the ocean. No one had planned it. No one had organized it. It simply happened. A silent tribute, not to a celebrity, but to a promise. Years later, people would remember that evening in different ways. Some would remember the tears. Others would remember the song.
Many would remember the necklace. But those who were truly there always remembered something else. They remembered how quickly people had laughed at a girl they did not understand, and how, only a few minutes later, the very same crowd stood together in tears because they had finally learned her story. Sometimes, the greatest acts of love are invisible to everyone except the person carrying them. Sometimes, the promises we make in passing become someone else's reason to keep believing. And sometimes, a dream waits patiently for almost 20 years. Not because it has been forgotten, but because the right moment has not yet arrived. That evening, Elvis Presley didn't give the greatest performance of his career. He gave something far more valuable. He gave a grieving daughter proof that true kindness never disappears. It may fade like old ink. It may hide beneath the weight of passing years. But when it finally returns, it has the power to heal hearts,
Change lives, and remind the world that a single promise, kept at last, can echo far longer than applause.
The crowd came to see a legend. They left believing in humanity. And that was the performance no one would ever forget.